Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving headfirst into some seriously controversial territory. We're talking about the moon landing, man. Or should I say, did we actually land on the moon? We're going to be unpacking some of the biggest conspiracy theories surrounding this momentous event. We're talking about the stuff that makes you question everything you thought you knew. You know? From the flag waving in the windless void of space to the mysterious lack of stars in the photos, we're going to break it all down. We'll dig into the evidence, the arguments, and the counter-arguments, so buckle up because things are about to get seriously weird. Let's jump right into the first conspiracy, coming up right after this. Alright, so let's talk about the flag. The one planted on the moon, symbol of American victory in the space race. Conspiracy theorists point to the way it's waving. How can it wave if there's no wind on the moon? The moon is a vacuum, no atmosphere. There's gotta be another explanation, right? So here's what NASA says about the flag. They claim the flag wasn't actually flapping in the wind. The flag was attached to a telescopic pole to make it fly proudly. You don't want it just drooping down like a sad piece of laundry. So they used this telescopic pole to give it that full waving effect. It kind of looks like it's billowing in the wind, even though it's actually perfectly still. Alright, so we've tackled the flag conundrum. Now let's talk about something even more perplexing. The missing stars. You'd think that pictures taken from the surface of the moon would be jam-packed with stars, right? I mean, you've got no atmosphere to get in the way, just a pristine black canvas of space. But if you look at the photos from the Apollo missions, the backgrounds are surprisingly empty. No twinkling diamonds in the sky, just inky blackness. It's pretty eerie when you think about it. This absence of stars has fueled countless conspiracy theories. People say it's proof that the moon landing was filmed in a studio, where it would have been impossible to accurately recreate the vastness of space. I mean, can you imagine trying to light that set? They argue that NASA must have figured it would be too difficult to get the stars right, so they just left them out altogether. And when you look at it that way, it kind of makes you go, maybe they have a point. But hold on, before we get too carried away with the whole fake moon landing thing, NASA does have an explanation for this one too. They say it all comes down to exposure. On the moon, the surface is reflecting a lot of sunlight, making it incredibly bright. So to get a good exposure, NASA used a fast shutter speed and a small aperture. Those settings are great for bright objects, but make it hard to pick up faint objects like stars. Alright, so we're diving deep into the moon landing, man. This is some serious conspiracy theory stuff. People point to the shadows in the photos from the Apollo missions and say they just don't look right. Like, if the sun is the only light source, shouldn't all the shadows be parallel? And there are definitely some photos where the shadows are doing some weird stuff. They're going off in different directions, which has led some folks to believe there must have been multiple light sources. Like maybe a big old spotlight on a soundstage somewhere? I mean, I've talked to photographers who say it's perspective and the uneven surface of the moon that's making the shadows look funky, not some elaborate Hollywood setup. But dude, when you're talking about potentially faking the biggest event in human history, nothing is off the table. So we gotta ask the questions. Were there really massive studio lights used to simulate the sun on a soundstage? Or are these just optical illusions created by the way the light hits the lunar surface? It's a rabbit hole, man, a total rabbit hole. And it gets even weirder, man. There's this one photo, it's super famous in moon landing conspiracy circles, where an astronaut is standing in the shadow of the lunar lander. But here's the thing, he's totally lit up, like illuminated. Now how's that possible if the sun is the only light source? It's a great question. Some people say it's the Earth's reflection bouncing light back onto the moon. Others say it's the reflective surface of the lunar module itself. But let's be real, it's pretty damn suspicious. It's almost like someone forgot to turn off one of the stage lights or something. I'm not saying that's what happened, but it definitely makes you go, that's weird. We're talking about the biggest achievement in human history, right? Landing on the freaking moon? You'd think they would have double-checked the lighting before they started snapping photos. Just saying. Alright, so picture this. You're looking at one of the most iconic photos from the moon landing, right? Neil Armstrong, lunar surface, the whole deal. But then you notice something strange in the foreground. It's a rock. But this isn't just any rock, man. This rock has what looks like a letter C on it. And it's pretty damn clear, like almost too perfect, like someone wrote it there. Now I know what you're thinking, it's just a random natural formation, right? Maybe, but the conspiracy theorists, they're not buying it, they're saying it's a prop, like maybe the C stood for center and it was used to mark the center of the set. Now NASA, they came out and said it was just a hair on the negative or maybe some developing issue. They even released a higher resolution image where the C is gone. But the damage was done, man. The seed of doubt was planted. And once you start looking at the moon landing with a skeptical eye, it's hard to stop. Was it a stray hair? A hoaxer's mark? A glitch in the matrix? We may never know for sure. But one thing's for certain. The sea rock remains one of the most debated and discussed pieces of evidence in the moon landing conspiracy. Okay, so let's talk about the Van Allen radiation belts. These things are no joke, man. They're these two giant donuts of radiation that surround the Earth. And they're filled with high-energy protons and electrons that are trapped by the Earth's magnetic field. We're talking some seriously nasty stuff, like fry your electronics and give you cancer kind of nasty. And guess what? To get to the moon, you gotta go through them. There's no way around it. So the question is, how did those astronauts survive that trip? I mean, we're talking about technology from the 1960s. Did they have some kind of super secret radiation shielding that we don't know about? Now, NASA says the astronauts were protected by the spacecraft itself, and that their exposure was minimal. They say the aluminum skin of the spacecraft was enough to deflect most of the radiation, and they also say the astronaut suits had some protection built in, but some people aren't buying it. They say there's no way those guys could have survived that kind of radiation exposure. They say the astronauts would have been cooked alive. And honestly, it's a fair point. I mean, we're talking about levels of radiation that can melt your face off. So did NASA really figure out a way to protect those astronauts? Or was the whole thing just one giant hoax? It's enough to make you wonder, man. Alright, so picture this. You're coming in hot, landing a rocket on the moon, right? You've got these massive engines firing, kicking up dust and debris everywhere. It's gotta be chaos, like a Michael Bay movie down there. But then you look at the photos and something's off. The lunar lander is sitting there, pretty as you please, with barely a speck of dust on it. I mean, come on, man, where did all that dust go? Did it just decide to take a break? This is one of the big ones the conspiracy guys latch onto. They're like, see, NASA messed up. They forgot to dust off the set. And you know, it is kind of weird. You'd think there'd be more of a mess. But there are some explanations. NASA says the moon's gravity is different, so the dust settles differently. Plus, the engines were throttled back before landing. Maybe not as much dust was kicked up as you'd think. Still, it's a head-scratcher, man. Now we gotta talk about moon dust for a second. This isn't your regular Earth dust, you know, the kind that collects on your furniture. This stuff is crazy. It's super fine, almost like powder, because it's constantly bombarded by radiation and micrometeoroids. Some scientists have said that this fine dust wouldn't behave the same way as Earth dust when blasted by a rocket engine. It might get blown away in a completely different pattern, maybe even creating a sort of dust-free zone around the lander. Think about it like this. Imagine using a leaf blower on a pile of flour. It's not going to react the same way as blowing leaves, right? It's the same kind of deal with moon dust. It's a totally different animal. So while the lack of dust on the lander is definitely strange, it's not a smoking gun. There are explanations out there. But hey, that's what makes this stuff so fun to think about, right? Alright, so if you're going to land a giant freaking rocket on the moon, you'd expect a little bit of a show, right? I mean, those engines are powerful. They should have blasted a crater right into the surface. But, and this is where it gets weird again, there's no crater. The lunar lander just kind of sits there, like a feather that landed perfectly on a pillow. It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? The conspiracy theorists, they love this one. They say it's proof the whole thing was staged on a soundstage somewhere. You know, like in those old movies where they used wires to make it look like people were flying. And look, I love a good conspiracy theory as much as the next guy, but this one's a little tough to swallow. I mean, did they just forget to bring a leaf blower to rough up the landing site? Now NASA, they've got an explanation for this one too, of course. They say the moon's gravity is weaker, and the atmosphere is super thin, so the engines wouldn't have needed as much power to land. They also point out that the lunar lander's engines were designed to spread the thrust out, kind of like a shower head. This would have reduced the pressure on any one spot, preventing a big crater. Plus, the lunar surface itself is pretty solid. It's been bombarded by asteroids and meteorites for billions of years, so it's not like soft sand where you'd expect a big dent. It's more like, I don't know, landing on a giant rock or something. Still, it's hard to shake that image of a massive rocket gently touching down without leaving a mark. It's just one of those things that makes you go, huh, that's weird. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the thing that really gets people fired up, the photos and footage. I mean, that's our window into the whole thing, right? But what if that window is dirty? What if it's showing us something that isn't real? There are folks out there, and they're not all wearing tinfoil hats, who believe the whole thing was shot on a soundstage. They point to things like the way the flag appears to wave in the windless environment of the moon. And then there's the whole lack of stars in the background. I mean, space is supposed to be full of stars, right? Shouldn't they be brighter than ever on the moon? These are valid questions, man, but here's the thing. Photography, especially back then, was a lot more complicated than it is today. You couldn't just point and shoot and expect a perfect picture. There were limitations with the technology, and that might explain some of the weirdness we see. Take the flag, for example. It wasn't actually waving in the wind, it had a telescoping pole to make it fly proudly, and the wrinkles were from it being folded up for the trip. And the stars? Well, they were there, but the cameras couldn't pick them up because the lunar surface was so brightly lit by the sun. Now, I know what you're thinking. Couldn't they have just added the stars in later? And the answer is, yeah, maybe. But why go through all that trouble to fake a moon landing when you could just actually land on the moon? It's like ordering a fake Rolex when you could just, buy a Timex. It just doesn't make sense. Plus, there were thousands of people involved in the Apollo program. If it was all a hoax, wouldn't someone have talked by now? Look, I'm not saying there aren't still unanswered questions. There are. But to say the whole thing was faked? That's a tough sell, man. A tough sell. Alright, so we're talking about the moon landing, right? One of the biggest events in human history, supposedly. But some of the original NASA tapes from the moon landing are just gone. Poof. Vanished. NASA claims they just misplaced the tapes. Misplaced. It just doesn't add up. Now, I'm not saying I'm a full-on conspiracy theorist, but the missing tapes add another layer of weirdness to the moon landing. If everything was on the up and up, why not be completely transparent? Why not release everything you've got? What are they trying to hide? It's like they're asking us to believe in magic, but won't show us the rabbit. The theories about what's on those tapes are all over the map. Some think the footage shows astronauts freaking out because they saw aliens. Can you imagine? Aliens checking out your spaceship. Others say the moon landing was filmed on a soundstage, like in the middle of the desert. They say the lighting and shadows in the footage don't look right. It's like that Stanley Kubrick movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey, that had convincing special effects for its time. Imagine what the government could have done with their technology back then. Look, I don't have all the answers, but I think it's healthy to question things, especially something as massive as the moon landing. The missing tapes are just one piece of the puzzle, but it's an intriguing piece. Why would the US government fake the moon landing? Remember the historical context. The Cold War was in full swing. The US and Soviet Union were battling for global dominance. It was like two alpha gorillas fighting over space. The Soviets were winning at first. They launched Sputnik in 1957, and Yuri Gagarin went to space in 1961. It was a huge propaganda victory. The US needed a big win. Enter the moon landing. Landing on the moon was the ultimate power move. It showed America was still top dog. But it wasn't just about one-upping the Soviets. The moon landing was also a way to unite the country. Remember, this was a time of massive social upheaval in America. The Vietnam War was raging. Civil rights protests were happening all over the place. The country was incredibly divided. A successful moon landing would be a much-needed morale boost, something that everyone could rally around, a symbol of American ingenuity and perseverance. And let's not forget the economic benefits. The space race was a huge driver of technological innovation. All that money poured into NASA led to advancements in everything from computers to materials science. A successful moon landing would justify all that spending and cement America's position as the global leader in science and technology. So, yeah, the potential motivations were there. National pride, global dominance, technological advancement, even just plain old-fashioned competition. It was a high-stakes game, and faking the moon landing might have seemed like a gamble worth taking. Well, there you have it, folks. We've gone deep down the rabbit hole of the moon landing conspiracy theories. We've talked about the weird shadows, the waving flag, the missing tapes, the whole 9 yards. Whether you believe we really landed on the moon or think it was all a big hoax, one thing's for sure, it's a hell of a story. If you found this video even remotely interesting, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into intriguing topics. And be sure to leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Do you believe the moon landing was real? Or do you think it was all a big fat lie? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep those minds open and keep questioning everything.